Good afternoon to all. Let me extend our warmest welcome to His Excellency Mohammad Javad Zarif, Foreign Minister of the Islamic Republic of Iran, to His Excellency Ambassador Henrique da Silveira Sardinha, Undersecretary for Asia Pacific of Itamaraty. Today, the Instituto Rio Branco is honored to have as our distinguished lecturer, Minister Mohammad Javad. Let me say, Minister, that in the Brazilian Diplomatic Academy, we followed with great interest as you masterminded the successful negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, reached by Iran with the P5 and the European Union in Vienna in 2015. This victory of the Iranian diplomacy sparked high hopes around the world that this agreement would be a fundamental stone in easing tensions and opening new horizons for peace and security. Reports from the participants in the negotiations highlight Ministro Zarif as the shrewd negotiator, capable of using all the tricks of the trade to overcome apparently insuperable difficulties in clinching this historical deal. Minister Zarif has a PhD in International Studies and an MA in International Studies from Denver University, and also an MA in International Relations from the San Francisco State University. After this lecture, I'm going to sign with my Iranian counterpart, the Dean of the School of International Relations of the Foreign Ministry of Iran, Mr. Mohammad Javad, a memorandum of understanding to establish an academic and diplomatic cooperation agenda between the Instituto Rio Branco and the Iranian Diplomatic School. We are extremely confident that this MOU will provide the basis for improvement in our mutual knowledge and strengthen the ties between diplomats of both countries. Diplomats, as we know, are the ones who open the doors for understanding and mutual respect between countries. Minister Zarif, we are all eager to hear you and to learn from your experience, but before I give you the floor, I'm giving the floor to Ambassador Henrique Sardinha, that's always address us.
Thank you, sir. I just want to extend another warm welcome to Minister Zarif. Say that he had a long and busy day in Brazil today, in Brasília, meeting with high-level Brazilian officials, but he was nevertheless kind enough to come to Rio Branco to speak to young Brazilian diplomats, and after his speech we will have opportunity for 2 or 3 questions and answers, because Minister Zarif has to run to the airport. He's flying in a few minutes from the end of this meeting. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Once again, welcome, Mr. Minister. You have the floor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means, in the name of God, the compassionate and merciful. We in the Muslim world traditionally use this when we want to start. But these days it's even more important to remind ourselves that the God in whose name some people kill is known to us in the Islamic world as compassionate and merciful, not as belligerent. So it's a good reminder for all of us, particularly for us in the Muslim world, to always remember. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here today, this afternoon with you, in this beautiful rainy city, It's been a great experiment for me to be here in Brasilia for the first time. After having served for almost 35 years as diplomat, I never had the opportunity to visit your beautiful city. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And it's a great pleasure to be at this prestigious institute talking to future diplomats. Let me use this opportunity to share with you what I believe to be important for all of us in diplomacy, both those who practice diplomacy as well as those who analyze global relations. This is particularly important because Iran and Brazil share a great deal. We share common values and common interests. Iran and Brazil have been at least in the forefront of the fight against nuclear weapons, but at the same time of the fight for the right to have nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Probably we share this almost dichotomy, dual principles of peaceful use of nuclear energy without any arbitrary limitations, but at the same time refraining from moving to weaponize this peaceful use. In other areas also, Iran and Brazil share similar views on having an independent foreign policy as countries with a lot of influence in our own neighborhoods and beyond our own neighborhoods. We've shared those values and we have tried to work together even in international fora in order to promote that. So it is important for us to have a clear perspective of the context, global context within which we are operating, and I just want to share with you how I see and how we in Iran see this global context. We are moving away from a rigid global system which existed in the period that was known to us as the Cold War. After the World War, till the collapse of the East Bloc. Some people believe that it was the failure of Soviet Union. Others, in my view, mistakenly believe that it was the triumph of the West. And those who mistakenly believed it was the triumph of the West tried to institutionalize that victory through several years of wars in the 90s and early 2000s, leading to a lot of misery for a lot of us. But I do not want to dwell on that today. I want to deal with what we are in right now. We are in a transitional stage. A transitional stage not only because we have moved away from a rigid bipolar world where we all knew what we were doing and how we had to act, into an era of international relations where things are much more fluid. Things are not as rigid, not as clear-cut, relations are not as clearly defined, not anymore. So that's one important characteristic of the environment within which we operate. The second important characteristic of the environment within which we operate is that it's a post-Western global order. It doesn't mean to be an insult to Europe, but it's just a statement of reality. In the past, at least in the past 200 years, whatever shaped the international relations were either happening in Europe or were directed by Europeans or Americans for that matter. now things are happening and affecting our world, which are neither happening in Europe, nor are being directed or controlled by Europeans. Look at non-state actors. The so-called Islamic State, which, as President Obama rightly said, was neither Islamic nor a state. But that group has an impact on global order, but it's neither operating in Europe, nor is it controlled by Europeans. A lot of other developments in the Middle East, elsewhere, in Asia particularly. You remember the policy of pivot to Asia by the United States. It was because many developments which were affecting global order were not taking place in the Atlantic, but in Asia Pacific, or as President Trump likes to call it, Indo-Pacific. This is a new reality of the changing global order. Another important change that is taking place in this transitional period is the fact that states, and we all represent states, and you will be representing a state, and we are all, as diplomats, very jealous of the fact that we are representing the state, but we have to recognize that states have lost monopoly. States used to have monopoly of everything that happened in the global scene. Even individuals were considered subjects, not actual actors, but subjects of states, because states were omnipotent and omnipresent in the global scene. Gradually, since the beginning of the 20th century, states started to lose that monopoly. They first lost the monopoly in the area of economy, then they lost the monopoly in the area of culture, then they lost the monopoly in the area of information, and finally they lost the monopoly in the area of organized use of force. That is war. States used to have monopoly in waging war. Now they don't. So not only we have a post-Western global order, emerging global order, we don't know what that order is. We still don't know about it. But we even have not a demise of state, but a post-monopoly of state situation in the world. So that's another important factor. And it's a promising factor, because now every individual human being both has the capability to affect change, as well as the responsibility to affect change. And that's a blessing. Of course, every blessing comes with a lot of challenges. Challenges that the order is no longer orderly, and we need to be prepared for it. Another important area that we need to be cognizant of in this new, fluid, post-Western, post-state global system is the fact that everything is now globalized. Now, if I were to tell you that I'm going to erect a wall around my country in order to preserve our environment, you would laugh at me. And you would tell me that you cannot have a safe environment while the international community, the globe, is going through global warming, whether people believe it's scientifically sound or not. You have a beautiful, environmentally sound city in Brasilia, but you don't feel that the global environment is of no concern to you because you have a sound environmental city, environmentally friendly city. That has become, of course, President Trump tries to challenge every bit of accepted reality, calling it whatever, fake news or alternative reality or whatever. But that has become an accepted reality that we cannot have environmental protection in one society where the world is going through environmental disaster. We also more or less know that we cannot have prosperity in a world that is generally deprived, because economic well-being requires others to be well off in order for markets to operate and for the global economy to operate. But we still fail to recognize that we cannot have security if others are insecure. And that's a very serious failure of diplomats. Because we diplomats, when we negotiate, we try to gain more for ourselves at the expense of others. The entire concept of deterrence is built on the fact that you can have security by depriving others of their security. And what is the outcome? The outcome is MAP, mutually assured destruction. That's the concept on which security in a nuclear world is founded. That I feel secure because you are confident that I can destroy you if you want to destroy me. And I don't know how many of you had the chance to visit New York after September 11th. I did. I lived in New York for a big part of my life. But in 2001, I was not posted in New York. I came back to Iran in '92 and went back to New York in 2002. So during those 10 years, I was deputy foreign minister in Iran. But I did visit New York immediately after September 11th. There was a session of the General Assembly of the United Nations devoted to terrorism, and I attended that session. And if you look at the faces of New Yorkers, you saw that the greatest power on the face of the earth could not do what every state must do, and that is to provide security for its citizens. You know, the United States alone spends more money on armaments than the next 10 countries combined. You put together everything that Russia and now after the United States we have China, and even after China we don't have Russia anymore. We have Saudi Arabia. US spends about $600 billion a year on armaments. China spends about 230 something on armaments. Saudi Arabia 67 billion, and then Russia with 62 billion. But you put all of these countries together, the next 10 countries, and they don't spend the 600 billion that the United States does. But this country with so much military expenditure could not provide security for its own citizenry in its most important cities, in New York and in Washington. You looked at the faces of the Americans and you could see in their faces the fear. You look different, I mean, like I did or my wife did with scarves on, and you walked in the streets of New York and everybody would call the police. That level of anxiety represented the fact that you could not, even as the United States, have security if others were insecure. You could not say Afghanistan is far away, that I don't have to worry about Afghanistan. No, if Afghanistan is unsafe, then New York is unsafe. And even now, after 17 years from September 11th, we have yet to realize that globalization doesn't only mean environment is globalized or economy is globalized, it also means that security is globalized. And it is an important cognitive transformation for all of us to recognize that security is globalized. That you cannot have security at the expense of the security of your neighbors. Now we put all of that together, then we have to come to a new conceptualization of international relations. Some people may call it idealistic, some people may call it outside the realm of reality of politics, but I call it a necessity, an absolute necessity for us to recognize this. And we, in our region, which today represents a lot of challenges to the international community, we need to come to this realization that we cannot have security in Iran, for instance, if Iraq is insecure, or if Yemen is insecure. But we need to make even a more fundamental realization, and that is we cannot have dominance over our neighbors. The time for hegemonic tendencies, both globally and regionally, is long gone. You know, the United States spent a lot of money trying to institutionalize, as I said, what they believed was a victory in the Cold War. President Trump has recently said that we spent $7 trillion. The $7 trillion that he believes the United States spent in the Middle East was not just to bring democracy or to fight terrorism, but it was an attempt to institutionalize US dominance. If you don't believe me, read the literature. Foundation for the New American Century. And this was the name of an organization which led US policy. And it didn't start with George Bush Jr. Look at President Clinton's record. Every single year, President Clinton had a major war. Be it in Somalia, in Libya, in Iraq, in Kosovo, in Yugoslavia, a military operation. And then when it came to Bush Jr., you had the entire enchilada. But the consequence of that, the $7 trillion that was spent, the United States was not able to achieve hegemony globally. So if the United States cannot achieve hegemony globally, no one can achieve it in their region. It's impossible to achieve hegemony. The era of hegemonic tendencies is long gone, if we ever had that era in the history of human beings. So we need to recognize, and I think you in Brazil have made that important recognition, that instead of being the strongest in your neighborhood, you need to have a strong neighborhood. trying to be the strongest in your neighborhood involves rivalry, arms race, disaster. Look at what's happening in our region. And we need to move that, and I believe it's a paradigmatic shift, a paradigm shift, that you need to move from trying to be the strongest to trying to build a strong neighborhood. We also need to move away from the concept that we can create blocks. Our security paradigm for a long time has been to divide the world into allies and enemies. By excluding some people and attributing all blame to them, you felt comfortable mentally. But it didn't work. We need to move away from that because, again, building allies and enemies means that you try to have security at the expense of insecurity of others. And I think if we can move from this, then we start recognizing a very fundamental principle, that we no longer have zero-sum games. In our world today, we will either have positive sum games or negative sum games. We will either win together, in easier terminology, or lose together. If there is a war, does anybody win in a war anymore? Does anybody win? Has the United States won Afghanistan? Has the United States won Iraq? What happens is the degree of loss is different. That is, the country we believe has won the war, in fact has lost less than the country we believe lost the war. That's the only difference. But everybody loses in a war. You go for a zero-sum game, you end up with a negative sum outcome. Let me tell you about our nuclear experience. We believed in Iran that we did not want to produce nuclear weapons. We had the right, as you do, and I believe you are as adamant about it as we are, to produce nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. And that includes having centrifuges to enrich uranium. You do it and we do it. So we believe that as long as we allow the International Atomic Energy Agency to look at our program, it's all right. And then the Americans believed that if Iran had a single centrifuge, it would be capable of making a decision at any time in the future to break out of the global non-proliferation system and build its own bomb. So we had two different perceptions of reality. And we both went for a zero-sum game. We said, US concern is not about business. And they said, Iranian dignity is of no concern to us. The net result, the US went for zero enrichment. In 2003, we offered to the Americans, we offered to the Europeans because we were not negotiating at that time with the Americans, that we would limit our centrifuges. John Bolton, who's today the National Security Advisor of the United States and at that time was Under Secretary of State for disarmament and non-proliferation, said no, not a single sentence. The outcome. When we started this in 2005, Iran had less than 200 centrifuges. And the Americans objected to Iran developing less than 1,000 centrifuges. When we sat down again, negotiations broke out. The US went to the Security Council, imposed sanctions on Iran, and the rest is history. We sat down in 2013. Instead of 0 centrifuges that the United States wanted to have, Iran had at that time 20,000 centrifuges. So the zero-sum game that the United States followed produced a net result of 19,800 centrifuges. But let's not go to the judge alone. The zero option that we wanted to produce. When we started this zero-sum game, we had a growth rate of plus almost 6.77%. When we sat down to negotiate, we had a growth rate of minus 7%. So who won? Zero-sum games are bound to produce negative sum results for all participants. And that's where we need to make the change in our mentality. And if we make that change, a lot of things become possible. A lot of impossible scenarios for resolution, like in Syria. If we look at Syria from a zero-sum perspective, there is no solution. We need to continue fighting forever. If you look at Syria from a positive sum perspective, then there can be a solution. We offered 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago, a political solution for Syria. Ceasefire, a national unity, inclusive national unity government, intra-Syrian negotiations and constitutional reform and elections. People rejected that, believing that they could have a military victory. Look at where we are now. When the Yemen war erupted, just about 3 years, exactly 3 years ago, we offered another 4-point plan. An immediate ceasefire, urgent humanitarian assistance, intra-Yemeni dialogue, and inclusive Yemeni government. People believed that within 3 weeks they could achieve military victory. 3 years on, tens of thousands of Yemeni casualties, 1 million Yemeni suffering from cholera, no end in sight. It's because of trying to achieve at the expense of others, because of believing in a zero-sum outcome. So I think for those of us in diplomacy, it's a very difficult task, and it's bound to create a lot of domestic enemies for you. But I believe the only way out of a never-ending process of just accumulating losses under the guise of winning, but we are accumulating losses, $7 trillion for the United States, and a lot of human suffering, a lot of human casualties, both in our region as well as in the US. Instead of accumulating these losses and claiming victory, we need to change our cognitive order and get out of this cognitive disorder that we have been entrapped for many years. I'll stop here. give you a few minutes for questions and answers before I have to run to the airport. Thank you very much.
Well, the floor is open.
Excellency, thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for this inspiring speech. My name is Daniel. I'm one of the students of Instituto Rio Branco. I'll keep it simple. I'll keep it short, but not simple.
Nothing is simple.
Do you think a positive sum game mentality is possible in the Middle East within the next 10 years?
To be honest with you, not really. But what is the alternative? What is the alternative? In reality, I do not believe that diplomats and statesmen are prepared to move away from that. But I'm not that ambitious about Middle East. I'm ambitious about my own neighborhood. And I believe it is possible to start a positive sum game in the Persian Gulf region. The way to do it for us is to address the most important problem that we have. We don't talk to each other. So if you asked in 1965 whether a conference on security and cooperation in Europe was possible, people would say no. But in 1975, it was made possible by some people accepting to start at not a huge achievement, at a very modest starting point. Now, I have proposed for the Persian Gulf region, and Persian Gulf region has been a very dangerous region. It has been the scene of the worst wars. The Iraq war against Iran, then the Iraq war against Kuwait. You know, the zero-sum mentality, the exclusion mentality, people who armed Saddam Hussein to invade Iran became the victims of the armaments that they provided to him. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait provided close to $100 billion worth of armaments in the 8 years that Saddam fought us. And in 2 years' time, we started using the same weapons against them. So it's been a region that has been fraught with wars. And if we start by very simple principles, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference in the internal affairs of each other, and allow everybody in this region, if they believed in those principles, to enter. And then ask them to do some confidence building measures. They can start from rather easy stuff: tourism, cooperation in environmental protection, cooperation in nuclear safety, because there are going to be a lot of nuclear power plants built around the Persian Gulf region. And then move to more difficult areas. Like, if it's not heretical to say, reduction of armaments, because President Trump right now wants more and more expenditure in armaments. I mean, he showed this, you've seen the poster that he sat down with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and had a board showing all the goodies that they could buy from them, and said that the money that you're spending on buying weapons is peanuts for you, so spend more. Now, we need to do the reverse. Reduction of arms expenditures, mutual military visits. And I think if we start with that, we can make a change. And I think, there are no intractable difficulties in the Persian Gulf region. But right now, the Persian Gulf region is the most volatile region probably in the world, other than probably Korean Peninsula. And Korean Peninsula is going towards reduction.
Any other question? Yes. Yeah. you.
Hello, my name is Fernando. I'm one of the students here right now. I like to say that it's an honor to hear you here in this room. You've mentioned the post-Western world, and I'd like to know from you if you believe in a post-American world as well.
But if it's a post-Western world, it is certainly a post-American world. We never had an American world. The Americans wanted to believe that it was American century. You remember? American century. But never achieved that. But the West did achieve it. For a very long time, maybe a couple of centuries, whatever happened in the world either happened in Europe, in the West, or happened by the West. But right now, that no longer is the case. So certainly post-American world is a reality, but post-Western world is a more clear reality.
Last question.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for such enlightening remarks. It is truly an honor to attend a lecture with such a prestigious authority. So my question is, in the past years, Brazil has been a huge partner of IRN regarding the transmuting process related to the Pacific use of nuclear technology. In the years to come, what do you think are the main areas in which Brazil and Iran will cooperate?
Well, I think Brazil and Iran are two important emerging economies, and we can in fact cooperate in this area. We have made important advances in areas from nanotechnology to aerospace to biotechnology, and we can cooperate in those areas. So that's one of the areas of cooperation that we can in fact achieve. Cooperation in global international issues, from peace and security to environment, are areas that we have already been working together. So I think the whole range of areas of cooperation, but for now, I mean, during this trip, I brought, as you know, a group of almost 100 CEOs with me, and this morning they had a very good meeting with their Brazilian counterparts. And I think that's the type of action. I mean, Brazil is a member of BRICS. You see that it is important for us in the emerging economies to work together in order to improve the living conditions of our population and in order to improve the level of prosperity, particularly in the developing world. So these are a whole range of possibilities for us to work together.
Minister, please rest assured that you leave with us many, very instigating reflections that will resonate among us during a long time. Before I close, I will ask your permission to invite the Dean of the International School of International Relations of Iran to come to the table, and we are going to sign it, the memorandum of understanding between our two diplomatic academies.
We stand up and sit down. You sign.